Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's so nice to see so many of you here. I've been having nightmares. We were going to fill the place and have standing room only or nobody. It made me proud. Give yourself a hand. I have to use notes, so please forgive me. My name is Sandy Peterson, and I am the current president of Civility First. We do want to thank you for attending our forum, How to Be Friends and Disagree on Politics. At this time, I would like to take the opportunity to recognize my board members who are here. Our executive director, Celia Shore. One of our newest board members, Pamela Grace Beatty. Our brand newest, in the back, LaFleur Barrera. I see our most current past president and the leader of our workshops in the back, Kate Bracey. And I am delighted to have our President Emeritus, Kathy Whitmire. Where'd you go, Kathy? And her husband, former board member Tom Ewell. Thank you so much for being here. I see a few elected officials in our audience tonight, and I want to thank you for helping to govern us. I went around the room, and I think I got everybody. If not, raise your hand. I'd like to welcome Commissioner Jill Johnson. City Councilman Brian Stuckey. I should say Oak Harbor. Oak Harbor City Councilman Eric Marshall. And Oak Harbor City Councilman Shane Hoffmeyer. I don't see anyone else that is elected. If I have forgotten you, would you please raise your hand? Oh, and Lynn Goebel, you are the president of the Oak Harbor School Board, is that correct? Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. I also see some folks in the audience who are candidates. So if you have stepped into those muddy waters, please raise your hand. And, and thank you for participating in the process. Now see, here we go. All right, you should have been given a couple of pieces of paper when you came in the door. One is our civility pledge, which we hope you will consider signing, and the other is our evaluation sheet. Your opinion helps us tailor our programs to do a better job for you, so please consider signing that for us. I'd like to welcome and help me thank this evening's co-sponsors, and when I call your co-sponsor's name, if you are part of that group, please raise your hand so we know who you are. The first is the Island County Democrat Party. The second is the Island County Republican Party. The League of Women Voters are here tonight and we're part of our co-sponsors. Whitby Weekly and Printing helped us out a lot. I know Eric's back in there. The Republican Women of North Whitby are here. And the Voter Interest Project. I'm here. Thank you to everybody who showed up and helped set up this room for everybody. I appreciate it. We couldn't have done it without you. I do want to take just a minute of personal privilege and offer a special note of thanks to Alan McFeeters. He is the executive director of the Voter Interest Project. He's running our recording tonight. He helped us immensely in putting everything together for our event and making sure that everything looked good for our publications and countless other things that I needed his expertise on. So Alan, thank you. Civility First was born about 5 years ago when a group of Whidbey Islanders became concerned with what we saw as the normalization of uncivil discourse. And we didn't much like it and wanted to change it. So we knew that if people could learn to listen with curiosity to a perspective other than their own and learn how to present their own views in a way that could be heard, there was a chance we could communicate better and not be so inclined to demonize one another. I believe that you are going to see some perfect examples of that from our panel tonight. Our moderator this evening is Ken Carvey. He is a retired communications director whose award-winning career includes video and podcast hosting, TEDx event organizing, disaster training, and crisis management. The last 10 years of his career were spent with Snow Isle Libraries, and as a note of interest, he is a former Civility First board member. Along the way, Ken has rubbed shoulders and interviewed politicians and personalities across the spectrum while surviving countless media interviews and interrogations involving news and entertainment media. He has also worked in the trenches, dealing with a full range of crises, emergencies, and disasters, as well as behind-the-scenes organizational embarrassments, internal scandals, and threats to public perception. He currently writes a blog called In His View, his being capitalized. He lives with his wife of 44 years and 2 golden doodle puppies on the island of Camino, where he says all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all of the children, dogs, and cats are above average. We also are pleased to have Denny Heck with us this evening. He serves as Washington's 17th Lieutenant Governor and is serving tonight as our governor, by the way, because Mr. Inslee's out of town. He brings a lifetime of experience in the public, private, and non-profit sector. As Lieutenant Governor, he is the president of the Washington State Senate and serves as acting governor when the governor is out of the state. And he runs his own small agency whose legislative priorities include international relations, housing, and economic development. Lieutenant Governor Heck currently serves on the Export-Import Bank of the United States and is a member of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. Lieutenant Governor Heck was previously elected to be the first United States representative to Washington's 10th Congressional District, where he served on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the House Financial Services Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee. And we go ahead, yes. Senator Ron Muzzall is a 4th-generation resident of Whidbey Island. After graduating from Washington State University, he returned to the 10th Legislative District with his wife, Shelley, to farm with his parents. Ron, his wife, and their 2 daughters own and operate a really cool, wonderful tasting market called Three Sisters Market, and you can find their hogs and cows and everything else you can eat some of the other grocery stores on Whidbey Island as well. He's a lifelong member of the Oak Harbor Lutheran Church, and he currently serves as council president. In Olympia, he is our district senator in Olympia serves as the current ranking member on the Agricultural, Water, Natural Resource, and Parks Committee, and is the assistant ranking on Health and Long-Term Care. He is a member of both the Ways and Means and Rules Committee. And he may not tell you this, but I will. He was very instrumental in acquiring just about $30 million for our school district so that we could take advantage of a 4-to-1 match. So if you would help me welcome these fine gentlemen to the stage. Thank you.
Hi, Ken.
Hi, Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck.
And the red means it's off, so there's a little.
There you go. And State Senator Ron Muzzall. It is a pleasure to share a stage with you this evening, and it's also, as Sandy said, a relief to know that we're not just having a conversation amongst ourselves, that we've got people who are hanging on every word, every period, every comma, every semicolon.
Obviously not mine.
Well, we're here to have a conversation about the what seems to be an increasingly incredible thing, which is a friendship that somehow bridges political differences. And it is sad to say that as we watch the news, as we listen and to the radio, as we check our emails and our social media, we see more and more evidence of a lot of rancor, bitterness, anger, and just a widening division between people who of different political parties, of different ideologies, different perhaps spiritual beliefs, maybe coming from different places but finding themselves living in the same place. And we get to talk about how the two of you have been able to maintain relationship. And so I'd like to get us started by giving you kind of an opportunity to maybe just share for a minute or two about how did you get involved in politics? How did you come to become an elected official?
You want me to start?
Yes, please.
First of all, thanks for having me here. Secondly, if I can digress a little bit, I think I really need to do this. Even though she doesn't hold elective office, and she hates it when I say this, I do want to acknowledge the president of Washington, the presence of Washington State Second Lady, my wife Paula. I really feel compelled to do that because Paula and I are newlyweds.
Newlyweds of how many years?
47. So the question is, how did I first get involved in politics?
Yes.
Well, as in my first actual involvement or my first interest. Be specific, Ken.
When did it enter your mind that you could ever win a race in an elected sense? You could ever be elected to office?
Well, the first strong interest I had into attempting that, I can remember vividly because it was as though it was the day before yesterday. I was in the 3rd grade. My teacher's name was Miss Heck, no relation. I'd never met anyone with the same last name as me that I wasn't related to. She greeted me on the very first day of school, and she grabbed my cheek and said, "Oh, so you're the little boy with the same last name as me?" And I thought, I am not going to like this woman the same last name or not. But come January, she did an amazing thing that affected the trajectory of my life. It was January of 1961. She wheeled a television into our 3rd grade classroom. Now, I grew up in a very working class neighborhood. About half the households in my neighborhood did not have televisions yet. And here she brought it into class. And it was January 1961, and the older people in the room will all know why she did that, so that we could watch the inauguration of John Fitzgerald Kennedy as president. And I was struck by the pageantry and the celebration of democracy that the inauguration represented. And then quickly, I'll just say this. The first time I was ever involved in a political endeavor, a little bit bittersweet for me to recollect now. It was just 5 years later. I was in the 9th grade. It was 1966. And there was a very young man running for auditor of Clark County who had organized a political party organization in my junior high, of which I was president, and I went out doorbelling for him. And it's bittersweet because he went on to serve 14 years in the United States Congress. His name was Don Bonker, and he passed away 2 weeks ago. But that was the first time I got involved. The first time I thought I could run and win because, frankly, I didn't know any better, and I was young and full of myself, was in 1976. I was 23, turning 24, and I thought I could get elected to the State House of Representatives. Actually, it turns out I could. Maybe not the best decision by the voters of the 17th Legislative District, but that's when it happened. Sir.
So, I don't know how to follow that one up because we're diametrically different when it comes to that sort of thing. But the one thing we have in common is that introducing my wife Shelley, who has been a huge inspiration in my life, and I told her that the reality of life is that my life has been happy because I met her 38 years ago in January, married her 38 years ago in October. We had a short courtship, and yet it was 3 years later before we had children. So the reality is that I spent a lot of years, what I thought was a lot of years, anyhow, looking for the right person, and I found it. So this is why it's diametrically different, and you and I had this conversation earlier. I never had an interest to be involved in politics. Though on the outside I was chair of the political action committee at a co-op that I was in, spent a fair amount of time in Washington, D.C. lobbying, had worked with county government through Growth Management Act, was on committees there and the like. And I was in governance positions in cooperatives, 23 years worth, 15 years Skagit Farmer Supply Board, 8 years Land O'Lakes Cooperative, several years involved in the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. So I'd been involved in governance. It wasn't until 19 that a particular individual and some more of her friends came to me and encouraged me to put my name in for the appointment for the empty seat left by Senator Barbara Bailey. And the greatest shock to me was a year later I was elected to this position. So being in politics, this was only my 4th session in Olympia. Being involved in governance, I've had a lot of years of being involved in governance, but it really came as a shock to me that I ended up in the position that I'm in, Ken.
So how did the two of you meet? Do you recall that meeting, or?
We serve in the same chamber, Ken.
But that can be in some ways just a situation where the two of you are gazing at each other across the chamber.
Yeah. I really like Ron because of Shelley.
And Paula is an incredibly nice human being. And when he said to invite a friend up here, they were all busy. So I asked the Lieutenant Governor.
I like him because he teases a lot, because he doesn't mean any of this, do you, Ron?
Oh, no. I don't know why it would start. Of course, you lost a family member, but that was only, I think it was before that I was, I don't know. I know that we do not agree on everything, and sometimes I get a little frustrated with some of his decision making, but I feel the same way about my children. Somewhere along the line, we began to kind of pass the time of day and recognize that I think we recognize we each have a sense of humor, but inherently we can give each other a bad time because we know we don't mean it.
Well, I think one of the reasons why I ask is sometimes we can find ourselves in friendships and we can remember essentially the catalyst for that friendship, what that sprang out of. Other times we may find ourselves in a relationship with someone and we've essentially grown into something without being able to really recall where it sprang from. But at some point, typically you realize that there is connection, that there is something that causes you to not turn away from one another, but to turn towards one another. And do you recall perhaps when?
Well, and we were talking about that this evening. So my first session there, we had a lieutenant governor who I did not appreciate a lot, and so then his term was up, and that there's a lot of protocol in the Senate. So I have to be he's lieutenant governor when he's not up in front of the Senate. When he's up on the dais in front of the Senate, he's the president. So it's always Mr. President. So, but I also can refer to him by his first name, but I have to watch myself all the time that I'm calling him by the appropriate terminology that exists. But it was the first year, it was in 21, and something came up, I don't know what it was, and I had a floor speech, and I talked about how, interestingly, it was April of 21, 40 years, almost to the day previous, My senior class and I had come to Olympia and it was civics, and it was Mr. Ivy, and I was walking down the hall, because I didn't even have Ivy, I think I had Herbert or somebody, and Ivy said, hey, do you want to go with my civics class down to the Capitol? I was like, yeah, sure. So, I mean, I was the only one besides, other than the members of his class to get on it. We went to the Capitol. It was interesting. We got to go up the top of the dome, which you can't even do anymore. And it was a great day, but I was reminiscing on the floor of the Senate. And I finished up, and I sat down, and he was standing there, and he just stared at me. So I'm getting used to this new president of the Senate, and I'm thinking, what did I screw up? What did I say? Because we have protocol we have to follow, and it's his job to call us on it. Thinking, what did I say wrong? What did I do wrong? And he's just standing there staring at me. Well, then he went on to relate 40 years ago, would you say you were in your third term in the House? Anyhow, 40 years ago, he was a legislator in Olympia. I was a senior in high school, which can't tell us the difference about our age. But anyhow, so I think that was, because then he did it with humor. He was chiding me about, the difference. 40 years ago, I was here, and you were just a senior in high school. So I think that was one of the first times I realized that you had a sense of humor, and that you could, and he felt comfortable digging me. He could poke the bear with me, and it wasn't. And so I guess if there was a moment, that was probably it.
I don't recall the moment. I'll just say he's a good guy.
So I've had opportunities to work with a number of elected officials, and almost without exception, everyone that I've worked with has told me that how challenging it can be running for office and doing all the things it takes to essentially run a campaign, and then finding yourself elected, and then trying to remember, who am I representing? Why am I here? Who am I representing? And wanted to just ask each of you, because I think we would all be interested to know, how do you work to represent kind of all your constituents, or do you find yourself thinking of that it's more important to represent some, not all, or how does that work for you?
Oh, so I'm on the hot seat first. You got way more experience than I got in that, but okay. I think it may be a little easier for me, just because maybe it's genetic makeup, but as a farmer, we have to make decisions every day that are going to affect our future. We develop an innate ability to absorb the information, look at it practically, what's going to benefit us. I try to not make decisions based on politics or anything else. What's the right thing to do? What is the right thing to do? Now, Denny may look at that with a different values system. So I read something a few years ago that said 40% of our political makeup is genetic. So when we're born, and it was interesting because what they did is they did a study of identical twins who were separated at birth, raised in different homes, brought them back together again years later, and they found out that they were very similar in their political philosophy. And it was consistent that way all the way through. So you're born into families that may go one way or the other. Then life experience has the remaining 60% of how you're going to end up. So when people start demonizing members of the other party, however it works, I always remind myself, well, it can't be helped. In a lot of cases, that was predestined how they were going to look at life through the lens of their mind. So we're going to differ on maybe our initial, how we look at things, but when we have discussions, then we can find where we are. And I'm amazed at how unempathetic some people can be at different views of things, and it's just how we see it. But I really try to just make every decision based on how I feel the right thing to do. But it also, in our case, we have to look at the constitutionality of it. We have to do the legal, the unintended consequences. I mean, these are not simple decisions that we're faced with.
So I don't think it's difficult if you're grounded enough and remember why you ran. And in fact, in all the years of intermittent service, I haven't been involved directly in public service all these 50 years since I was first hired by the legislature in 1973. I've been out of public service more than in, but as Al Pacino said in Godfather 2, just when I got out, they pulled me back in. But, you know, if you're grounded, if you know why it is you're there. I have told prospective candidates and candidates forever, the most important question you can answer is, why are you running? And it better be authentic, and it better resonate with who you are and why you're expending this effort to get there. And actually, I think there's only one answer to that, and it is to make a difference in people's lives. Now, different candidates and different elected officials have different definition of how to make a difference in people's lives, and that's what the public policy deliberation is all about, and we all benefit from that. But if you remember who you are, it's not that hard.
So with the time that, Lieutenant Governor, that you've spent in elected office, especially with all of the times you've been pulled back in when you thought you had escaped, is there something that about the work that you've done or the role that you've had to play or called upon to play that you wish that people better understood?
Well, I'm having a good time now as Lieutenant Governor, reminding a lot of people what this job is. I have to say that in 50 years, I've never encountered a position about which there are more misconceptions. And there are two giant misconceptions about the job of Lieutenant Governor. The first of which is people think the Lieutenant Governor is like the Deputy Governor and part of the Governor's administration. And that's just not true. A Lieutenant Governor in this state, according to our Constitution, is elected separately. We don't even have to be members of the same political party, and I've served under multiple instances where that was the case. So even though I become acting governor, as I am tonight when the governor's out of state, or would become governor if, God forbid, he got hit by a bus, the truth is I'm not a part of the administration. And the second biggest misconception is people think I'm the 50th state senator. There are 49 of them. There's only one sitting on this stage. But I am always asked, hey, would you vote this way on that bill? And I have to tell them, I don't vote. The only instance in which I vote is if there's a tie. I've been at this going on 3 years. One time. Actually, I voted with the Republicans that time, if Ron will recall. And they're also asking me, would you introduce a bill to do thus and such? Our Constitution only provides that privilege to 49 people, and I'm not one of them. So I often find myself explaining to people what it is I do. And the most important job, in my humble opinion, that I do has been referenced, which is to act as the presiding officer of the state Senate, to enforce the rules, and hopefully to set a tone of a respectful discourse.
And I think that is one, he does a great job of demanding respect amongst the Senate members, and he sets that tone. And and I'm not taking anything away from the rest of your job as Lieutenant Governor, but in session, when we are in session and the Senate is in session, he's the referee that keeps everything moving along, and he sets that tone, and he does an incredible job of that, because we are there to have this public discourse on really important things, and some of them are very, very passionate. I mean, it is not uncommon to have real deep emotion in this conversation.
Does deep mean loud?
No. I have a voice that kind of carries, and so sometimes probably it does get a little, but it's not passionate, but not over the top. You could probably comment on that better sitting up front.
Agreed.
Well, the term or the word referee, for me, brings up kind of a whole new appreciation for the role that you play, and it just brings to mind that it must mean that you can never be asleep, you can never be preoccupied with something else while the session is going, while there's debate and comment being made on the floor, and you're smiling as I'm saying that. Why are you smiling?
I can't exaggerate to you how much I appreciate that you would be insightful enough to observe that. There's really only one person during Washington State Senate deliberations that has to be on 100% of the time, and that's me. In case somebody were to stray on the rules, I have to be able to bring it back to our deliberations. I'm the one that calls on people, for any of you who've ever watched this on TVW, so I have to be constantly scanning to see who is rising and who might go, and there is a...
Who decides to not call?
I have never once not called, well, maybe that one, well, maybe. I've never not called on it. But there's a strategy to it. I alternate between the majority party and the minority party, or if it's a highly bipartisan bill, I'll alternate between somebody who's in favor of it and somebody who's against it. And that requires me really paying attention to all sorts of physical cues and all manner of things. There are actually other people who have to pay attention all the time, but the individual member, in many instances, will have read ahead of time any amendments or the bill, and they know how they're going to vote by and large for most bills, not all bills. And so they can be shock, gasp, awe, maybe doing other kinds of homework that relate to their job, waiting for the time to cast a vote. I got to be dialed in all the time, and it just really makes me feel good that you would pick up on that. It's actually kind of you. Thank you, Ken, very much.
Well, it's hard work.
Well,
that's hard work.
I have a great team that helps.
Well, and it can be very stressful work, and you're exactly right. The 49 of us out there, we're doing other things. We're working on other projects as this is going on, listening to the debate, figuring out amendments, whatever the case is.
Robbing people on the next bill.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think misconceptions of your job. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what goes on the floor of the Senate and the protocol and the rules and the expectations and so on. I mean, I've had people from home here, well, you just need to go down there and you need to do this. I'm going, whoa, what? Well, yeah, you did. Well, first off, a bill, you got to come up with a bill, and you got to get it written, and it's got to go to the code revisor, and then you got to get it to a committee, and then it's got to be heard in the committee, and then it's passed on. It may have to go to another committee, and so on and so forth. And then it has to go to rules, then it has to be pulled forward to the floor. In any one of those cases, it could be stopped for one reason or another. So to come up, I mean, pardon my language, but a stupid bill is not going to get anywhere. It just doesn't go anywhere. Secondly, on the floor, if I get up and there are a whole bunch of rules. I mean, we're not supposed to use trade names. We're not supposed to use any foul language. We're not supposed to refer to the other part of the legislature on the floor. We're not supposed to, the rules.
Most importantly, friend.
Okay.
You're not supposed to impugn the motives.
Exactly.
Of another member of the legislature.
Right.
Or
the reputation of other elected officials.
Absolutely.
Or, we have protocol and code, and that's one of the reasons that it remains so civil on the floor of the Senate, because we have rules that we are required to follow, and if we were to violate those rules, there's a certain individual that sits up in the front who thinks it's his job to call us on it.
So it seems to me that when you talk about impugning the motives or the reputation or the birth order or the birthplace or the birth family of someone else, that really moves us and maybe moves our conversation into the areas of civility. And one of the things that I love about tonight's event is that each one of our audience members have been given a copy of the Civility Pledge, and they've been given and are being given an opportunity to really think about what's on that pledge and consider signing it, and essentially pledging that they're going to pursue civility in their life and with their neighbors and within their families and in the workplace and other places. And it seems as if there is well, let me ask it this way. How often does the President of the Senate find a need to kind of halt someone who is straying into areas that's becoming uncivil?
Or violative of another portion of the rules. I don't keep track of that. There were a few times this year. Although this year, I would say for the first time maybe ever, there was never a point of order raised requiring a ruling on my part, which is usually the flashpoint of contention. And I want to make this observation about the Washington State Senate. We just went through a magical session in terms of the level of respectful discourse. And the evidence of that is that there was never a point of order. And I would further offer evidence of the number of bipartisan bills that passed. Even the operating budget, which is almost always a partisan measure, passed with 37 out of 49 votes, including the minority leader and the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee. Frankly, I would characterize how they conducted themselves this year as the single best I've observed in 50 years, and they were a paragon of civic virtue. And I think there is an enormous amount of credit to be extended to the leaders of both political parties, the majority leader, the minority leader, the floor leader, the minority floor leader, and especially the chair of the Ways and Means Committee and the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee. You will pick up on it occasionally. You won't read about it that much. Oftentimes it's not the job of the media to cover success. But I will tell you in all sincerity, with all conviction, that they made me proud to be in the chamber with them by how they dealt with one another. Yeah, they got, my mom used to have an expression, owly, like cranky. They got owly once in a while. And yeah, there were a couple of times I had to tap the gavel. They're human beings. That's not the measure of it. They didn't get personal, and they were almost always respectful. And look, this isn't the question you asked him, but we got to go here. What's the downside for this increasing rancor that you alluded to? This demonization of people with whom we disagree, this ad hominem, as it is called. This is increasingly present in our national political culture. And it is toxic. And it is toxic, my friends, because if I'm engaged with the debate today with Ron on an issue with which we disagree, and I stoop to demonizing him, what happens tomorrow when there's another issue on which we might be able to find common ground? He's going to be a lot less receptive tomorrow if I've spent today calling him an SOB, because that would be human. So this is not just my opinion. The Pew Charitable Trust has polled the public multiple times on this subject, and its most recent poll reveals that 93% of the American public believes incivility is a somewhat or a very important problem in America. We are not headed in a good direction as a country as it relates to this issue. And the health of our democracy is at stake. And so I guess where that leads me is I want to thank those of you involved in this effort locally for what you are doing. And in fact, I strongly suspect, and I'll talk about the efforts we've undertaken in this regard later, but I strongly suspect it's just such local community organizations of diverse people that come together that say, you know, we can disagree, but we got to figure out how to disagree agreeably so that we can move on.
So it was a conversation you and I were having, and I mentioned that Annette and I, Annette Cleveland's the chair of health and long-term care. I was ranking member at that time. We had a online forum talking about civility because Annette and I worked together very well in health and long-term care. Something came up about that, and you were like, why didn't you invite me? And I was like, because she was the first one that came to mind, well, I want to do something like that. So you're here tonight because you had asked me about it and then said, I want to do something along that line. And I appreciate that. You're a busy guy, but your passion for this, you made time to be able to do this and wanted to be involved in a discussion about civility. My mom always used to say, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say anything at all. Okay, well that wasn't easy when I was younger. And I'm still guilty of it. But the years of board experience that I had sitting on boards of directors, we had, one of the boards I was on, there was 27 members of that board. And honestly, it was over half the number that we have on the Senate floor. We were going through a really tough time with that organization. In fact, we were really close to not being solvent. In 8 years I was on the board, we got it turned around. I hired a new CEO, on and on and on. I learned an awful lot about working with people. And the one thing I already knew, but it became so profound in that, is that, if they hate your guts, they probably aren't going to want to do something with you. And the quickest way to have somebody hate your guts is to insult them. And I don't care if you don't agree. I don't care if you, why make them angry? And so that has been my goal in the Senate, is to work with those across the aisle, because I need them in order to pass bills. And I need them in order to be able to work with them, and it isn't all bills. I mean, we have a lot of things that we do there, whether it's our capital budget, whether it's our operating budget, whatever, that is important to get things done. Sandy mentioned the money I got for Oak Harbor Schools, and that was, I burned some political capital there, but we had $106 million in federal funds that we're not going to get if we didn't come up with that $27.5 million. And so we got the first one, and then it just turned out we had another pot of money for early learning, which the second elementary school, which is also on federal land, that's our Center for Early Learning. So I was able to get, I think that one was $13.9 million. So we got that. There wasn't a bill there. It was just lobbying members of that committee, working with the members of that committee. When we finished with policy for the Senate and the House, one of the other senators that's in our caucus, his name was Curtis King, and I always joke when I grow up, I want to be a king, I want to be a Curtis King. When we finished with policy, he and I were tied we had 8 bills apiece we'd gotten across the floor of the Senate. So we were tied at number 1. The only thing is he had 3 agency requests, I only had 2 agency request bills, so I ended up in first place in our caucus. By the time I got through the House, my 8 had gone to 5. And so I ended up, Keith Wagner ended up with more bills, but we had 30% of the bills that went through this year were Republican bills. And with the minority that we have in the legislature, that's amazing.
If you want to know how good it is, and I mean this, go online and read what's happening in the Oregon State Senate. You want to know how good it is here in Washington State? Look at what's happened in some other states. I call this Northwest nice, you know, where we wait for the light to change to use the crosswalk. It's in the water. It's a part of our heritage. But I also, when I tell people that, I hasten to add the same influences that are degrading our national civic culture, we're not immune from. So we have to renew this all the time. We don't just win this one time forever. So that is as a predicate to say thank you again for your work here on civility.
Well, you mentioned the word incivility, and that word is often used as the antonym to civility, the opposite of civility. But are there some other opposites of civility that you've seen that you essentially try and work with other senators and representatives to avoid?
So we have launched a civic health project in the Office of Lieutenant Governor in partnership with the Jackson Foundation, which was formed by Scoop Jackson's heirs, and something called the Ruckelshaus Center, which is a kind of a giant dispute resolution center named for Bill Ruckelshaus, who is EPA director under Nixon, that operates jointly with Washington State University and UW. I had to say WSU first, and the University of Washington. And we're engaged in an effort to be able to come up with some recommendations that are actionable, that are achievable, that will make a difference. My going in bias is that what our objective really ought to be is two things. The first of which is to elevate respectful discourse through any means that we can. And most of our conversation here has been around respectful discourse. And I think on some level we all understand what that is. But there's a second one that I feel equally strongly about, which is that we have to reinforce or elevate the notion that our default bias ought to be to lean in to try to find common ground. Doesn't mean we're always going to find it. At the end of the day, there are going to be just differences in values that we will not be able to bridge. You know, vive la différence. This is America. There's a diversity of values and opinions, and that will be the case. But our starting position ought to be, where can we find common ground? And therefore, come up with something, a principled compromise that will help solve a problem. So I think it's two things. I think it's respectful discourse, and I think it means an ethic of saying we need to find common ground.
So I think two things. One, perfection is not attainable, and I hear that in people declaring political parties, and we've had some great presidents in the United States, but each one of them was a fallible human being. There's no perfection, and there's no perfection in public service. I think that one of the biggest issues, and we just had a special session in the legislature. It was to deal with the Blake decision. We called it the Blake fix, and it was a long, drawn-out affair. Not as bad as things in the past, but it was difficult, and I got up and spoke to that. And I think that one of the things that's leading to the divisiveness is hopelessness. And honestly, going forward, it's going to be...
Can I just stop you there? I want you to say that again, because I think it's a really important point.
It's hopelessness. Hopelessness in our society is becoming just caustic. It's becoming pervasive, and it's transmitted amongst people. So when I talk about hopelessness is what's led us to the substance abuse problem that we have in our society today. Hopelessness in our political process has led to the divide and the incivility. You know, they just feel hopeless. And I mean, on and on, we can go to a bunch of things. And I think that it's become pervasive, and I think people allow themselves to get there, and then once they've given up hope, that's what's led to a lot of this. And so my goal moving forward, and it's going to be part of what I'm really committed to, is bringing hope back. Bringing hope back to public discourse, bringing hope back to politics, bringing hope back to life whether it applies to mental health. We need more treatment. We're working on that. We're doing that. When it comes to substance abuse, we need more treatment. We're doing that. We're working on that. But it's the hopelessness of those. And during the discussion there on the floor, it just, the day after session, my 42-year-old niece died of chronic liver failure was a result of her alcohol addiction. It was, I had about 3 really dark days there. And she had lived with us. She had everything going for her, but she could not get over her chronic addiction. Left a 9 and a 7-year-old little boy, a husband, successful business. I mean, alcohol is the drug of choice in my family. That's how people kill themselves slowly. And I spoke about the hopelessness on the floor. And in fact, I appreciated that afterwards too. It was a really raw. We've got to help people with their hopelessness, because the hopelessness leads to all the bad things in our society. And I guess that's my message, Ken, is that one of the reasons we've reached this point of being uncivil to one another is pure and simply hopelessness, and that's a choice.
And I would also suggest, frankly, that the poor state of civic discourse leads to it as well, because what it enables us to do is see other people as the other and less than human. And that's the consequence of demonization. You know, if you see somebody else as a human being, you're more likely to take the time to listen to what they may have to say, even if it is at odds with what you see or believe. A lot of that going around.
Yeah, I refer to that as the zations. So generalization, marginalization leads to demonization. And when we start down that
Words are your life.
Yeah, I know. When you start down that path, then you end up with what you're talking about, and then it's subhuman. And if we really want to take a look at history, that's how we've ended up with in the history of humankind. I mean, the great tragedies of the world have always come from that demonization of another race, whatever the case is, and we've got hundreds of millions of deaths that are connected to that very thing.
Well, before we go further, just want to express, our sadness with the loss that you've had.
Yeah, it is still raw, and for somebody that was so successful. Her memorial service was in Benaroya Hall. Macklemore spoke at her service about what a tragedy it was. Mike McCready, for those of you who are in the new wave grunge, he sang at it. She was connected. She had everything in life to live for, but she didn't have hope. And really, it was kind of, as far as I was concerned, it kind of pulled together everything that I've been working on in the legislature when it comes to behavioral health and what we've been doing. It's the hopelessness.
Well, I think about, with your saying that, I think about when I was a child, oldest son of in a military family. My father was stationed in England. And so we were there for several years, and this is back in the 60s. And in the 60s, in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, there was an ongoing conflict. It was essentially a civil war happening over in Ireland. And even as a child there, I was aware of it, because periodically there would be in the news, there would be a bombing or some kind of shooting or something, either one side shooting soldiers or soldiers shooting civilians, or what they consider to be insurgents or rebels, and all. And oftentimes children were killed in the process and get caught in the crossfires, and that seemed hopeless. That was it was just pervasive, that it was never going to end. It had been going on for decades, it seemed like, and there was no end in sight. And I was just reading something a few weeks ago about the 25th anniversary of the peace treaty that ended that civil war, that it seemed so hopeless. And George Mitchell, who had served in, at the national level in politics here in the United States, had been, I guess, appointed envoy and ambassador to Ireland, and so went over and tried to work with all the parties to see if he could bring them together. And so he was reminiscing about what had occurred and what he thought was in some ways, the magic potion that brought everyone together. And he said it was listening. And we said it was years and years of listening. Well, 5 years, he said 5 years of trying to pull everyone together, because there had been so much marginalization, because there had been so much, what was your second? There was a generalization, marginalization, and demonization. Because all of those zations had been happening, and there had been essentially kind of reason upon reason upon reason for people not to want to work together, not to talk with each other, definitely not to sit down at a table together. George Mitchell said that they worked for 5 years, but he said 2 of those years were spent listening, going to each side and simply asking questions, and then just listening to what they had to say without offering an opinion, without taking sides, but listening. And he said over the course of 2 years, each of the other sides suddenly realized he wasn't taking sides, he really just cared. And that eventually brought them to the table. And it seems as if increasingly in our country and in our state, people don't seem to want to listen to each other. But have you seen examples in state government, in the legislature, of maybe some heroes who essentially are role models for listening to the other side, listening to their own side and other sides, to constituents? And
well, first of all, I want to say that we use the term respectful discourse or civil discourse, and we tend to think of discourse as being talking. But in fact, respectful discourse is every bit as much listening as it is talking. And another expression that my mother used to have was, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Do the math. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. You know, on the issue of heroes, Ken, and respectfully, sir, I'm going to reserve that term for people who run into burning buildings, or if we must apply them to politicians, it's when they take a vote that they know puts their career at extreme risk. But as it relates to the legislature, I want to go back to my quick reference to the fact that the operating budget passed with 37 votes. This is unprecedented, people. This is unprecedented for an operating budget, the single most important document the legislature enacts, when one party controls the governor in both the House and the Senate, to get that strong a bipartisan support. It is unprecedented. And I will tell you that I think the reason that happened is that the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Christine Rolfes, who is leaving the legislature because she's been appointed Kitsap County Commissioner, went to her Republican counterpart, Linda Wilson, at the beginning of the session and listened to her and included her and said, tell me what you need, such that when we got to the final debate on it, Senator Wilson stood up and said, at the beginning of the session, I told you I cared about three things. No new tax increases, slower rate of growth of state government, what was the special ed? Yeah, there was a strong commitment in the Senate Republican caucus to increase funding for special education in K-12. She said, there's a bunch in this budget I don't like, but you met all those criteria, so I'm voting yes. I would credit Christine, I would credit John Braun, the Senate Republican leader, minority leader, whose philosophy to legislating is constructive engagement. The easiest thing in the world to do if you're a member of the minority party is just vote no. It's easy to find a reason to vote no. You can always rationalize a no vote. A hard thing to do when you're in the minority, you don't wield the gavels, you don't get to set the agenda, is to figure out how to engage with the majority party in a way to make an impact and maybe make something that you thought wouldn't be very good less bad, or make something pretty okay. And that's the approach that Senator Braun takes to this. And I wouldn't call Christine or John heroes. They're not running into burning buildings, but I would say in both instances they were showing leadership.
Good role models.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as assistant ranking on two different committees, I spent till 9, 10 o'clock at night over in wasn't Jack, it was Jack. Anyhow, one of the committee hearing buildings going over budgets for, so in health and long-term care, we're responsible for a couple different agencies, and ag and natural resources, we're responsible for 4, really 5 with the Department of Ecology. They invited us in. The majority party invited the minority party ranking members in, along with the chairs of those committees, to go over the budgets of those organizations. We were there. We were in there making the sausage. And, you know, it's dirty work, and you get your hands all greasy, but we were there. And that's why so many of our caucus voted on the, we only went up 8.8%. It's the smallest growth in our state budget percentage-wise than we've had in, I don't know, the last 4 bienniums. And I mean, we were just barely larger than inflation. That was without any new taxes. And actually we had some small tax cuts for some areas. And so it was a bipartisan process. Every one of my bills, the second on it was from the majority caucus. And I, on my 8 bills across the floor, they were almost all majority going across because they were bipartisan. Because then I had had chairs or vice chairs of those committees signing on to them. They were good bills, and they were bipartisan bills. That's our job as in the minority, is to try to get done what we can get done. And sometimes there are messaging bills out there, but if we want to get a bill passed, it's got to be a good bill, and it's got to be bipartisan.
So I think this is a good time to interject another observation that's counter to most of the tenor of what we've talked about thus far this evening, but I think is important. Lest you leave thinking that it was all kissy-facey bipartisan, kissy-facey huggy-body bipartisan. I think we're too polarized in this country. I think we're too partisan in this country. And here's the nuance. Public policy is hard. Politics is hard because it is nuanced. and here's a nuance. There is a role for partisanship. And what I mean by that is, you don't want all bills passing unanimously in the sense that then you never learn how that bill might have been made better. You probably don't want all bills passing unanimously because the two major political parties have different values, and it would suggest, frankly, if they were all passing unanimously, they probably weren't having much impact out in the real world. On occasion, it is important to us as a society to have what, in a parliamentary system, they call the loyal opposition. That is for the minority to stand up and say, we have different values, I do not agree with this, here's how we think you could make it better, and this is why we cannot support it. The problem is that, at least at the federal level, it happens all the time to the point that we're not able to deal with some of the bigger problems. But I realize it's hugely unpopular to raise a small voice in defense of occasional partisanship, but I do think it is constructive if kept within bounds.
And we do. I mean, there were some bills passed this year which were straight down party lines, and we fought them kicking and screaming because we believed that they violated our values. So I agree. It isn't always roses and unicorns. And we got some small changes to the pursuit law, but I honestly had to walk off the floor at one point in time in the debate over the pursuit law because I was afraid that I might violate some of the rules that we set for ourselves.
You wouldn't have violated them very long.
This is true.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you had noticed the first stare that you got from him. I'm sure that you would have noticed this one as well.
It would have been an entirely different stare.
So how do you both feel about this culture that has been spawned that says, no, in fact, it is not okay to be partisan. In fact, it's not okay to be, to take a different position or have a different idea or a different stand on some other item, and because you do, then it's okay for me to essentially censor you or to shut you down so that you don't have the opportunity to speak up. How does the Senate kind of ensure that there's kind of opportunity for the voices that disagree to speak up?
The presiding officer recognizes anyone who wants to speak.
And I resent that.
Who would you like me to censor, Ron?
Well, not me, of course.
Well, I wonder if...
So I guess, are you referring, Ken, to the cancel culture that's
Yes.
out there?
Yeah.
So that does not occur, that cannot occur on the floor because the presiding officer, in following the rules of it, you can't be canceled. Now, we say that, but I'll tell you what, if you are, one, he can censor you on the floor if you violate the rules. But if you violate the trust or whatever of the majority party and you are in the minority party, your bills just may never make it to a hearing in front of the committees that have to be done. So you can put yourself, and it doesn't happen as much in the Senate, but it happens in the House where people put themselves in a position through virtue signaling or lack of decorum or however you want to put it, that they just never get any bills passed. You can put yourself in a position.
So this is a really good point, buddy. So there are actually people, and I can't relate to this, and Ron can't relate to this. There are actually people who run for the legislature, I don't think that many, but there are some whose goal is not to pass bills, or put another way, not to be a part of a public policy formulation that solves a problem. Their goal is to virtue signal, a term that I hear a lot, but I'm not sure I really fully understand. Their purpose is to message. And I can't relate to it. And there are people that don't see the world the same way I do, and God bless them. But we're sent there to make a difference in people's lives again and to try to solve problems. And the point of doing that in an institution of 49, or the one over here with 98, you've got to be able to work with other people and figure out where your principal compromise or your common ground can be. It's not to gain more followers on Facebook or Twitter. It's to go there to solve problems. And in fact, what I do not understand about the current political culture as practiced by some is why they don't see abject joy in actually accomplishing in that. My biggest thrill in the world is being in a room where we maybe pull together a diverse coalition and we figure out where our common ground is and we mobilize and we go to work and we get bills passed and we make a difference. That is joyous. Why somebody would not want to engage in that, I just don't understand. It's fun.
You're right. When I think back, not just in the Senate, when I think back on coming together and designing process that ends up, you mentioned Ruckelshaus earlier, I was part of the Ag Remand Committee here in Island County. We put together a plan to react to growth management to identify natural resource land, so ag, timber, and mineral resources. Then we identified that, we put the whole plan together. It was appealed, and we won, and ended up down Thurston County Court, because that's where all the growth management cases ended up, and Thurston County Court said, this is a really good plan. And Ruckelshaus Institute picked it up as a boilerplate to show other counties, hey, this is what all these people came together, created a plan. That was
fun.
Oh, joy, because we had diverse opinions, but we got it all together. And there were times when it was like I was pounding my head on a wall, but the reality is we accomplished the goal, and we did it. So why do these people stand off, feel like they're the lone voice crying in the wilderness, spend all their time on social media, scream, yell, foam at the mouth, but never get anything done? It's because they got a base of supporters that are there, oh, you're really doing something. No, they're not. But the misunderstanding of how the legislative process works is why it allows them to do that.
So we got to get into causes here.
Okay.
Because it's going to be difficult for us to change this trajectory and improve this condition if we haven't given some thought to what's bringing about this unhealthy civic culture. And I'm going to nominate the way the media has changed, in which we have 400 channels of confirmation bias, and especially social media platforms, which literally have a business model. This is true, this is not my opinion. Their business model is predicated on engaging you as frequently as possible for as long as possible. And what the neuroscience has revealed is that when they jump up and down on the part of your brain that activates fear or anger, there's a dopamine release, and it literally becomes addictive. So they construct these algorithms to take you down and down and down that reinforces and incentivizes the kind of behavior that we are getting. Which is, again, why I'm so incredibly impressed that you have this community-based, conversation-based model for bringing.
And if you don't believe it, read the book, The Chaos Machine.
Yeah.
It is incredible. And when I read the book, it was like, oh, that's why that. I mean, all of a sudden it was connect the dots. It's called The Chaos Machine. And it's about social media. And it isn't just, I mean, my first thought, oh, Facebook. But no, these algorithms are used by all of them, including YouTube. And so this is why all of a sudden you look up a subject, oh, then something like that subject comes up. And if you follow it, it'll take you down the path of, that's what I always thought. But that isn't reality. That isn't necessarily the truth. It's hooked you in and then brought you back. That was enlightening.
But you can say you saw it on YouTube.
Yeah, that's right.
So it must be true.
Yeah, if it's on the internet, we all know that to be true.
So, and a few minutes ago, I think maybe both of you have used the term common ground, and I'd like to just maybe spend a couple of minutes on that, because common ground seems like it should be as common sense, and sometimes that doesn't seem to be as common either. So for our audience members and for members of the public who will see the video recording of this conversation.
We're being recorded?
Oh my God.
Are there some practical methods or steps that you think can be used to establish common ground? And say I am the person who I ran a campaign that was essentially a social media campaign. I was pounding the media in my chest and the podium, saying I'm gonna accomplish this, and the other side are nincompoops, and I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna change it all, and I just need your help to get there. So, and then I've gotten elected, I come on board, and someone wise takes me aside and say, hey, look, if you want to get anything done, you got to establish some common ground. You got to find the common ground. How do I do that?
I'm going to briefly digress and then directly answer that question. I just want to make sure that my reference earlier to media, people understand that what I was referring to is the proliferation of cable television channels and radio stations that are basically advocacy journalism, what they call. I actually think one of the causes of the decline of health of our democracy is the disappearance of local journalism. And that's not what I meant by media. The first applause line all night. That's amazing.
And so got it, that's what's really amazing.
Eat your heart out, Muzzall. So I want to make sure that people understand we have a rapid decline in the number of local newspapers and the number of people that staff them. And there is some emerging scholarship that suggests this is not good for democracy. And of course, social media is frankly the culprit here too, because they pick up all of that content without paying it. And they have appropriated for themselves the advertising revenue. What was your question?
So how do I go about establishing that common ground? Are there some practical steps?
Okay, so again, I want to describe a new context that I think contributes to this, that social media is also a culprit in. I've already admitted that I first ran and got elected to the State House of Representatives in 1976. Just to be clear, I was 8 years old way back in 1976. And the meanest thing that my opponent said about me, frankly, was he's a young man trying to buy himself a political career. She said at one time, she was actually a spectacularly qualified candidate, but campaigns by and large weren't that hotly contested. I ran in a swing district, as it turned out. But campaigns have always had some hard punches through. We can understand this. I mean, think about what the definition of a campaign is. Ron and I are coming before you, running against each other, asking you to make a choice. So what both of us are incentivized to do, and make sense, is accentuate the differences. Compare and contrast. It is inevitable. Now, one of us gets elected. It was Ron, he beat me. He goes to Olympia. Now his job is to find common ground, to solve problems. So there is an inherent difference in the objective of campaigning and in serving. Amen. Right? Vote for me, find common ground, and solve problems. What is different from 1976 is we campaign all the time, 24/7. You all get emails every day. You get them from my political party. I am a proud member of my political party. Don't anybody misunderstand. Telling you the other guy is the worst human being that ever lived, and vice versa. You get tweets to this effect all the time.
Generalize, marginalize, demonize.
But it is different than it was just 50 years ago, which in the wider scheme of things wasn't that long ago. We now have nonstop accentuating differences, which makes it harder for the people who do make it to Olympia to figure out how to get the yes, shake hands at the end of the bargaining, stand up and walk away feeling as though they got enough to meet their needs.
No, that's, my wife reminds me from time to time, pretty simple motto, just be nice. Just be nice. And campaigns are difficult. And I made a commitment in my last campaign that I was going to talk about what I wanted to do and what I was planning on doing. I mean, it was structure, discipline, accountability. We need accountability in Olympia for our tax dollars, for the people we serve, and blah, 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 blah. I'll never forget, it was a letter to the editor, and this is pure politics, and it said, he's too old and he needs to go back to the farm.
Wait a minute. You're too old?
Yeah, I was told. The interesting thing is my opponent was 5 years older than I was. But, you know, I'm bald and gray, so the assumption is that I don't have any hair to dye. So the reality is that appearance-wise, he's too old and he needs to go back to the farm.
I'm going to take a risk. Raise your hand if you've ever watched Ted Lasso. Okay, less than a fourth. Ted Lasso is a runaway critical hit and a runaway popular hit on Apple TV. And for those of you who watch it, I'm going to tell you why. Because it's about kindness and decency. And America thirsts for more kindness and more decency.
Just be nice.
Just be nice.
So, to what extent do you think that part of the decline that is maybe captured from the chaos machine and social media, the algorithms, a different tenor of campaigning that comes from constant campaigning? How much is the lack of civics taught in our schools maybe part of that? Because it seems in many ways that perhaps newer politicians or elected officials, not necessarily older, I mean younger or older, but ones who are more recently elected, may not remember or be aware of how the Senate actually operates, how the House actually operates, that there is what the true role of a lieutenant governor is in connection with the governor. They may not understand the power and the constitutional authority of the judicial system in the state.
Well, I had this conversation with a school superintendent, assistant superintendent, and I said, God, you guys got to start teaching civics. And they said, we do teach civics. I said, well, okay, then I guess that's the more difficult part of the job. You got to get these kids to learn civics. 18% of the population pays attention to politics. Statistically, 18% of the population pays attention to politics. I believe that half of them is to local politics. So we've got less than a fifth of our population that pays attention to what's going on out there politically. So how do we get them to understand? I really don't know. I'll tell you a profound thing that happened to me as far as understanding the United States and politics, and that was to travel in foreign countries. if you are exposed to, and some would say third world, but I'll even say second world countries. So after visiting China, I spent 2 weeks in China. I had an entirely different view of the United States. After having spent 10 days in Brazil, I had an entirely different view of the United States. And after 2 weeks in South Africa, I had an entirely different view of the United States. And what's the basis to all of that? Civics, representation, lawfulness. Not lawlessness, but lawfulness.
The rule of law.
The rule of law. And you know, we inherently despise corruption. In those countries, they celebrate it. That's the difference.
So here's an interesting but disturbing factoid. People who want to become naturalized citizens take the citizenship test. It turns out that 90% of them pass on their first effort. 90%. Now I'm going to be completely upfront with you here. It's not that hard. There are 20 questions. You only have to get 60% or 12 correct. And the 20 are chosen from 120, which you get ahead of time, so you can study. Although I hasten to add, the test is administered only in English, and most of the people that take it, that's not their first language. 90% first try. The test has been administered to a cross-section of people who are native-born citizens. Barely a third pass. So the notion that we need to have a better understanding of the basics of our government is pretty clear. But speaking of natural, can I digress?
Yes.
Okay. It's one of my favorite stories from my time in Congress. They used to invite me to come speak at naturalization ceremonies. If you've never been to one, do it one time in your life. Take your handkerchief, it'll make your heart soar. And I went to this one in Thurston County. And at the very beginning, they asked the people by country to stand up. And there were 27 countries represented. And so we went through this highly emotional thing. Because I'm in Thurston County, there were an awful lot that were from Joint Base Lewis McChord because of our arrangement if you serve in the armed services to get to be able to do this. But there was one young man that stood up when Russia was announced, which got my attention. It turns out, when I was in high school, we had a very interesting faculty member whose original discipline was biology, but he began being interested in Russia and Russian language. He became extremely proficient at it and taught the Russian language, which I took for a couple of years. So I see this young man out there, not very old, kind of long hair, and I'm thinking, So after the ceremony, the MC says, if you'd like to have your picture taken with Congressman Heck, line up and we'll do this. So they lined up, and we go through, and I do the handshake and the smile, and I see the Russian kid down there, and they get closer, and they get closer, and he gets up to me, and I shake his hand, and I look him in the eye, and I say, Здравствуйте, товарищ. Как вы поживаете? Я говорю по-русски языка. Мое имя Алексей Викторович. Which means, hi, how are you? I speak the Russian language. My name is Alex, son of Victor. And this young man looked at me, kind of stared, and he blinked twice. And he said, dude, I don't speak a word of Russian. I came out when I was 2.
So you translated for him? I've had the opportunity as a military kid to live in a couple of other countries. And as well as different parts of the United States. And Ron, as you said, there is a greater appreciation for what you have here when you've lived and taken a look at what's really happening, how others live, what others experience in other places. And I really like the saying that if you think America is such a bad place, why are so many people trying to get in? Why do they take the time to become naturalized? And I think that that it seems to me that an interesting, perhaps, effect or consequence of so many naturalized citizens, new citizens, better understanding our form of government than those of us who are natural born do, is finding more and more of them running for office once they're here, becoming elected officials, and perhaps in some ways breathing new life, a new appreciation into the political process that comes from an appreciation of just how bad it was where they came from and how they don't want to see that happen here. What do you think about that?
The United States isn't perfect. It never will be. Like I said earlier, there's no such thing as perfection. Humanity is we're the fallen. But our strength in the United States has been historically the fact that we came from so many different cultures and the like, and through that the strength came. I'm a student of history. Most of you probably don't know anything about the Huguenots, the diaspora that fled France in the 1600s. The French Protestants fled France, somewhere near 500,000 of them. It was probably largely because they were of the trade class, they were the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers. And when they fled France, they left the peasant class, and they left the royalty. And the royalty, who had been Protestants, had already been killed at St. Bartholomew Day Massacre. So about 500,000 fled France. In the Low Countries, Holland to the UK, and to the United States. There was two groups, one in St. Augustine, Florida, one in Brazil. Both of them the Vatican had reached out to, and the Spanish killed all of those in St. Augustine, Florida in the 1600s. The Portuguese killed all of those in Brazil that were the French Protestants because they didn't want them to exist. But of our forefathers, Paul Revere, George Washington, Governor Morris, many of those who took part in the writing of the Constitution were the descendants of those Huguenots. Freedom of the press, first thing they did in France was shut down their ability to written information. The right to bear arms, they took their arms. Billeting of troops. The French billeted troops in the homes of those Protestants to ensure that they went to Catholic Mass. Our Bill of Rights is full of those things that came from that horrible time in France. If they were caught fleeing, they were imprisoned or killed. Their personal items were taken away. Back to the Bill of Rights. All those things came from that diaspora. The rest of the story, a large portion of them ended up going to the UK. Part of them ended up in Ireland. And in Dublin, there's a Huguenot way. In the place where the greatest religious war had been fought, as you mentioned earlier, they welcomed the Huguenots. And very interesting. The last part of the story is Muzzall is part of that Huguenot diaspora. My wife's maiden name, Bonser, same thing. Through the UK to the United States. Why did we end up here? Fled religious persecution to the UK. The UK, a lot of them were farmers. We couldn't own land, small holdings in the UK. We came to the United States in the 1800s for the ability to own land, which we had owned in France. Private land ownership was fairly prevalent, but it all got taken away. That's the reason. But that comes back to the same thing. Why our strength? because we left bad situation to come here and create a new situation. And that's what we're about. And we've lost sight of that. That you know, we've become hopeless because we've lost sight of the hope, this striving to become. But that's what the immigrants have, because we were all immigrants. Every one of us was an immigrant to North America, South America.
There's no question about the Huguenot influence, but also as a student of history, Ron, I just cannot help but make a slight amendment here. All of those rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights were not included in the original Constitution that the Founding Fathers you referred to wrote. They were forced to include them by popular pushback. So they weren't in touch with their Huguenot heritage. But I mean, you said it, right? I mean, except for Native Americans, this is a nation of immigrants. It is a nation of immigrants. And I think the point I want to leave you with in that regard is this is not easy. It has been very difficult. And it's going to continue to be difficult as we become increasingly diverse. America's not easy. America's hard. And diversity is hard. And it is always hard. And I don't need to lay out for you the challenges of people of color over a long period of time in this country. But it was true of the Irish. Irish need not apply. Signs all over New York. My wife's father, my wife is 100% Italian. You notice, honey, how I kind of slipped into my Italian accent? Italian. Her father was a very successful business person. He was a CPA, and he had a large accounting firm in Spokane. In the 1960s, he could not get admitted to the Spokane Club because his last name ended in a vowel. This is very recent for all practical purposes, and it is a part of our history, and it is a part of our future. America's not easy, America's hard. But if we got one takeaway from it, this nation of immigrants benefits from the people who come here.
So in our last few minutes,
They're tired.
I want to just swing back to relationship. There must be individuals in your life who have wronged you, have spoken unflattering things about you. If not spoken them, you could see them thinking in their faces. They've done something that led to either hurt or harm, and yet for the sake of relationship, for the sake of getting something done, you have chosen to overlook that or find a bridge across it. So how do you do that? Personal life, political life, professional life, how do you do that? And why? Why do you do that?
So, this goes back to, teachings, but turning the other cheek. You turn the other cheek unless it's physically or emotionally damaging. I think that there are times when individuals who are so unhappy with themselves that they become toxic that you've got to separate yourself from them. So I don't believe that you can always accept behavior of other people. Sometimes you just have to say, okay, I can't deal with that. But I think intent, determining what the intent was is really important. Did they say it just to be mean, or did they say it out of a moment of frustration, anger, whatever the case is? So determining intent, and then realizing that perfection is not attainable. Nobody's perfect. I mean, things are said. Lord knows my wife has forgiven me for more than what anybody should ever be forgiven for. Because, you know, marriage is a lot of hard work. That's the reason I married her. She's a hard worker. The reality is that I think that the main thing is determining intent and then deciding how you're going to deal with that. And it isn't just because you're deriving a benefit. I think you have to have character and make that decision based off of that, you know. There are people that I deal with in Olympia on a continual basis whom I choose not to let in close because of their behavior and intent. But that, by far, the majority is not that way.
It's a hard question, Ken. I'd probably say two things. The first is try and stay in touch with humility, because where that leads you to is remembering that each of us has not always been perfect, and it's not the full measure of us. We're not defined by our worst moment.
Thank you, Lord.
And the second is staying focused on business. To quote another great Italian, Vito Corleone. It's not personal, it's just business. So, you know, what's the objective here, right? The objective is to be as effective as you can legislatively so you can make a difference in people's lives. And the crap over here shouldn't get in the way of that.
So last question. The two of you have worked together for more than
2.5 years.
3 sessions.
3 sessions. There have to be individuals in each of your lives who question why the two of you would be friends because of what they consider to be just political differences.
I just don't let other people know that I'm friends with him. So keep it simple.
So, Ken, I want to get back to Lieutenant Governor 101. I don't vote on bills, so it's not like I'm walking around manifesting my point of view or stating it loudly. That's a pretty secondary or tertiary part of the job I do. So it's not like these differences are huge and clear and manifest.
Well, so let me.
He's a good guy.
Well, I actually hadn't asked the question yet. The question in some ways, because you are right. Perhaps not everyone knows that there would be any differences, but unfortunately, because of the world that we currently live in, that generalization, marginalization, demonization can be assumed that because there is a letter D that sometimes gets plugged behind your name and a letter R, capital D, capital R behind your name, therefore you two must be diametrically opposed always. And what I find is that there are individuals who will step forward and who will say, well, you must hate each other because maybe that's how I feel about that other side. You must not trust them because that's how I feel about the other side. You must not give them an inch. You cannot be good friends because I don't see myself being a good friend to someone that I disagree with. And so, but the two of you have this friendship that seems to be this bridge between two human beings who just happen to have D and R sometimes associated with their names. How do you do that? And what would you say to someone if they approached you that way?
Do you know Ron? I mean, Look, and earlier I hoped I adequately explained, at least for the time being, your Washington State Senate is not that way. I don't think anybody would see it as weird at all. Well, the dirty little secret is that Ron and I are members of the same book club, the Chaos Machine, and tomorrow he's hosting the book club. They're all most from Olympia. They're driving up to the farm to talk through this book. And it's comprised of D's and R's, mostly D's. And Ron holds his minority point of view up very effectively in that group. Now, he's not alone. And nobody thinks twice about this, really. In fact, makes it more fun and more interesting to listen to other people who have different views of the world.
Yeah, I don't look at it as abnormal. I look at it as normal, and I look at the other side of this as abnormal. The not having, I mean, in another thing we do share. So in my church, we've got all members of the spectrum of politics. And yet we all go on Sundays and sit down and worship together. We care for one another. Somebody has a memorial service. We all chip in for the food afterwards. I mean, we don't separate ourselves by a political party there, and we care for one another. I think that's what normal is. I think it's abnormal to say, oh, they're a this or they're a that. It's the generalization, marginalization, demonization again. So, and that's where our strength comes. We had an in-depth discussion on the Chaos Machine, and we had different views on how to solve the social media problem. And he and I, quite a bit different. In fact, you and I were the ones that were kind of arguing this point. And
Alan too.
Yeah, Alan too. But that didn't affect the relationship because I respect his opinion on that. I don't agree with him, but I respect his view of it. You know, of course, there's a thing there too, and I was taught to respect my elders, and so that I'm sure has some impact on that. But if Shelley, he kept thinking that. I kept thinking Paul was going to keep him in line. He kept thinking Shelley was going to keep me in line. That doesn't necessarily work. They're a long ways away, Denny. They can't reach either of us. Humor, finding commonalities. I tell people, when people come into my office in Olympia, the first thing I try to do is find a commonality. What do we have in common? I tell you, the only time it fails is when I have somebody come in my office and they sit there and they shake their finger at me and tell me how I have to vote. That's when it's very difficult to find a commonality because they're telling me how they feel and how I have to vote like them instead of having a conversation about the subject. But I think we have to normalize the commonality portion of it.
Well, so on that note, I'm just going to do a quick summary and then turn it back over to Civility First President. What I've taken away from our conversation this evening is that there are a number of C's that are wrapped around the word civility. There's common ground, there's conversation, there is communication, but there's also caring. And, you know, I want to just thank the two of you for being role models for caring about each other and the people of the state, and taking the time to really kind of walk us through what we can do better to essentially help keep our state working, help keep our communities working, help keep our relationships working. Because what you've shown is that there's great value and there's great benefit from being essentially intentional about not only having relationships, but also keeping each other accountable to do what it takes to maintain those relationships, so that it's not just a relationship today, but it's a relationship going into the future. And if we can continue to live together, then we can do some great things together.
We can have hope.
We can have hope.
Talk a little bit about the group. You asked me to be in the first meeting that we had in the rules room. Talk a little bit about your work there. I was so impressed with that get-together, that conversation that we had that day, which was a large group of people. I don't remember. I didn't.
Too big, actually.
Well, maybe too big, but I mean, it worked. And I don't think anybody walked out of that room without feeling like,
They didn't want to leave.
yeah, they didn't. We had 2 hours, I think, and we were not done. And it was a incredibly diverse group, and we found a bunch of commonality. But speak a little bit about that.
Well, I actually did earlier, the Civic Health Project that we've now launched, and the roundtable discussion that the senator was involved in was kind of a beta. We were just trying it out with about 20 people from extraordinarily diverse background on this issue of what's the status of our civic discourse, how would you define the problem, what do you think are the causes, how might we make progress in this regard. We decided to undertake this effort again with the Jackson Foundation, the Ruggles House Center. We're doing 5 roundtables. We've actually done 3. I have another one in Vancouver next week and one up in Port Angeles in 2 weeks. And we'll write an interim report out of that. And then in October, we'll have a big summit in King County, which will involve way more people. The roundtables are 8 to 12 people. Even at that, and then a report will come out. Even at that, I think it's just the beginning of the conversation that we need to have about what can we do to safeguard the health of our democracy toward progress on respectful discourse. Again, we don't win this one time. We have to win this on a regular and an ongoing basis. And the very last thing I want to say is, again, thank you for your role in that, in this community, having these kinds of conversations. You're so very kind to have given 2 hours to a couple of old guys up here to talk about this stuff. Amazingly patient, so bless you and thank you so very much.
Thank you. Sandy.
Were they not absolutely wonderful? Give them another round of applause. I think this was important, I think it was informative, and I want to know, did you love this as much as I did? Yes,
Sandy, I just wanted to say something else we can do is we can watch, and I want to first thank Denny for all of us for TVW, because we can watch the Senate in action, we can watch the House in action, and now what you've learned, you can see what it takes to get to that. And I say thank you to Denny because he was one of the ones who helped put it together to mesh that we even have it. And again, that's part of what is really important about civic education at the state level. And again, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So just in closing, I want to thank you all for being a wonderful office, and I just want to put in a couple more bids for Civility First, who's surprised by that. I'd like you to know that we are a charitable organization recognized by the IRS. So if you would like to give us a tax-deductible donation, we will be very helpful. We will be very, very careful with it and put it to very good use. We also have a couple of donation buckets here if you'd like to drop a little something in on your way out tonight. And if you would, please remember, if you do nothing else, would you please fill out your evaluation form so we can do this better next time, and your civility pledge if you would like. So I just want to say thank you all for coming. Stay safe and be civil. Good night.